Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight, 2 minutes later than we usually are, as we just marked 2 minutes silence to commemorate the end of VJ Day and the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. So the museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member, where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today I'm delighted to welcome Phil Craig, who is a best-selling author and multiple award-winning filmmaker, working on projects both here in the UK and in Australia. During his career, Phil has spent many years researching and reinterpreting the story of Britain and its empire in the Second World War, including his definitive account, 1940 Finest Hour. He now runs the Scandalmongers podcast. Today, Phil will be talking about his latest book, 1945 The Reckoning, which explores some of the geopolitical implications of the Allied victory in the Second World War. We are selling copies in the shop today, which I will be whisking Phil up to sign after this talk. There will be time for questions at the end of this discussion for both our online and in-person audiences. For our online audience, you can post them in the chat bar and we will put them to the speaker at the end of the talk. If you're in the room, just raise your hand and I will come around with the microphone. Moving on to some technical points. Should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of your browser. That usually cures all ills. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. With that all being said, I now hand over to Phil and hope you enjoy today's talk.
Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you so much, and thank you for the full house. I hope you're all here at the end of the talk. It's not always the case. Geopolitical implications sounds very serious. In fact, the books I've written about the Second World War, they tend to be led by really great characters. You'll get your geopolitics, don't worry. But the characters, the people, the stories of love and loss, I mean, this is really why we're still so immersed, I think, as a country in the Second World War. We still know people who either fought in it or the children of people who fought in it. And getting under the skin of what it was really like to be them is what's given these particular books and the programs I've made, I think, their special character. So the 45 of the Reckoning, as in the other ones, there's love, there's loss, there's courage, there's all sorts of passion, and a particularly good story about dysentery. So there is, but there is geopolitics, because I think certainly as we get towards the end of the war, most of this talk will be about the sort of political forces at play and how weaving those people in and out of the story of the politics is what makes, I hope, the books work. Now, I don't know about you, as I've got older, I might have become a little bit more reactionary, a bit crusty, thinking, I could look quite good in those red corduroy trousers. And I'm the sort of person who rolls his eyes and goes, oh, for goodness sake, when I hear one of these lefty academics saying, we need to pay massive reparations for slavery, or that Britain is the great villain of world history. I can get really quite cross about that. And yet, I want to start with a provocative question. Here are two photographs from the final acts of the Second World War. Well, that's D-Day. British soldiers on the beaches sent into battle under the beautiful and inspiring words of Eisenhower. They all read that morning, the hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere are with you as we together establish a free world. They've come to liberate France. It's extraordinary. I would never gainsay what they've done. In fact, I sometimes think all of the books I've done are a kind of extended love letter to the generation, many of whom I was lucky enough to meet, who won that war. I could not be more positive of what they achieved there and elsewhere. However, what's that other picture? That's one we probably don't see very often in this country. That's a British general, one of the heroes of Burma, General Greasy. That's a French general, General Leclerc. He liberated Paris. Well, he was allowed to walk in with de Gaulle and take a lot of the credit. They're soldiers of the Indian Army, the British Indian Army. They're in Vietnam. But they've not come to liberate it. They've come to put the French back in charge. What is it that Eisenhower said? The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere as we create a free world. All of this goes back to the Atlantic Charter, which was a document that Eisenhower and Churchill signed in 1941. very inspiring words in that document about a future beyond tyranny, beyond coercive control, in which people could choose their own governments. And this argument that we're fighting a war for freedom and self-determination informs so much Allied propaganda. And I'm sure it was all heartfelt. There's a famous pamphlet, in fact, which was sent to called the Way and Purpose of the British Army in the Second World War. And in this pamphlet, which all the soldiers read, said, we are no longer fighting for what we used to call imperialism in the disreputable form of that word. We're fighting for a future of independent nations, self-governing. So why are those people in Vietnam doing that? Well, I'll come back to it. And no, of course I don't think we're the baddies, but I think if you don't understand the role that empire plays, both in 1945 and indeed the whole of the war, you won't understand very much about it at all. Because we in this country were in love with this idea that we were the underdogs of the Second World War. It's Dad's army, it's the Blitz, it's Dunkirk, it's hanging on by our fingernails. But the rest of the world never really thought Britain was like that, because Britain never had been like that. Britain was an overdog. It ran enormous parts of the world, had a huge navy, and it had a massive economic resources. Those very resources that allowed it to be so brave in 1940. But there was also the fact that the post-war was going to be quite challenging financially. So hanging on to bits of empire, whether it's the French Empire or the British Empire, does in 1945 come to the fore in the minds of policymakers. And that affects some of the things I'm going to talk to you about. And it especially affects what's happening in India. Now, India is a special case. We all know that India gets its independence. And that's being celebrated today. In fact, there was a tweet by Prime Minister Modi. He's very fond of tweeting, is Modi. And he talks about these guys on the left, the Indian Army, by which he means the Indian National Army, run by a man called Subhas Chandra Bose. It was only about 80,000 strong, but it had hundreds of thousands of people in its political organization. And these are the people who are today celebrated in India as the real heroes of independence, because they fought for the freedom of India in alliance with Japan. Controversial. Yet, they are much better known than these guys here, who are part of the 2.5 million strong, all volunteers, British Indian Army, which I would argue plays a much bigger role in creating Indian independence. But if you put a tweet up today about these guys, you'll have the supporters of those guys saying they were mercenaries, they were colonial lickspittles, they weren't even real Indians. I think it's really sad. So a lot of my book tells the story of how imperial policy and the movement towards independence really defines this generation. I tell it by intercutting the story of two people. Commandera Subaya Thimaya, known to history as Colonel or General Timmy, remarkable man. Like many young men of his time, he was born about 1906. He was a believer in independence, but he also loved the British Indian Army. And I guess his whole career was really defined by the tension between his desire for independence and his loyalty to the army. And in learning about him, I got to know about this remarkable institution. And it really does become a war-winning machine. But it's also rather endearingly eccentric. Certainly in the 30s, when he's making his career, it was said at the time that the Indian Army, its favourite activities were tiger shooting, pig sticking, bridge and adultery. And actually, there was quite a lot to that. So, yes. I just want to read a little passage from the book to give you a sense of the style of how I write my books a little bit too. While he was dealing with the tribes in Quetta, in this classic imperial policing role, Timmy witnessed the Indian Army engaging in one of its favourite pastimes, sexual scandal. A friend of Timmy's from a Sikh regiment, another newly Indianized unit, was caught having an affair with the wife of a fellow officer. She was white and he was not, which led to much grumbling in the clubs. The grumbling had nothing to do with sex. There were plenty of enthusiastic adulterers in the regiment and very active in the community. In fact, a group of officers was using the notice board of the mess to advertise events that today we'd call swinger parties. And nobody seemed to care very much about that at all. Timmy's own commanding officer, when a captain, had deserted his wife to live with the wife of a junior officer, who had then himself moved in with the captain's abandoned partner. The 4 of them still remained on the base, enjoying these unconventional relationships, although apparently the women would sometimes snarl at one another after a heavy night in the club. A good sense of the openly promiscuous culture of the Indian Army at this time can be found in an examination set for the Staff Officers course in 1932. You are Captain Pio de la Faca from the 1st Battalion, the Royal Thrusters, and you are a rival to your commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel E.M. Bracer, for the affections of the frail and fascinating Mrs. I Lovett. The lady has informed you that her husband will be away in Razmak while she is moving for the summer to Missouri. Before forming your answer, be aware that Lieutenant Colonel E.M. Bracer is A, of a somewhat brutal nature, B, furiously jealous of your success with the lady, C, acquainted with her movements, and D, convinced you are a rotten officer. Required for the examination, a 1-page letter applying for 2 months' leave to Missouri. So that is what these guys were like. So he had this affection for the army. He served in, I mentioned Quetta. There's this terrible earthquake in 1935, and his unit absolutely distinguished itself by the work it does, both helping with the relief efforts and also fighting back. There's bandits that came down from the Afghan hills, determined to kind of loot and kill and steal. So he's in love with the army, but he's also a nationalist. In fact, he becomes friends with the Nehru family. At one point, he is ordered to take his men into the streets to confront a protest. There are lots of protests at this time. Gandhi is leading a big national movement that's internationally famous. And people pour into the streets demanding more rights, more votes, and eventually independence. Timmy decides he can't do this because he wants independence. So he goes to see Nehru. This is Motilal Nehru, the father of the future prime minister. And they sit down and have a talk, which he writes down in his diary. And Nehru says, we need men like you in the army. We need men like you to show us how we're going to run an independent nation. So swallow your pride, learn your trade, and one day you will be a great servant of India. This meant so much to him that he carried it around wherever he went, because there were other times during the story I'm going to tell you where he was rather tempted to leave the British Army. But I shouldn't just say he's doing it simply because of Nehru. I think he genuinely had affection for this remarkable institution. And of course, during the war, it expands hugely, and he leads it into battle. He becomes the first Indian-born, non-white officer to be given the command of a brigade of the Indian Army. And he's under a lot of scrutiny, because sometimes he's quite a character, as our Timmy. He's got a temper. He's got a certain amount of amour propre. That's what, the posh French way of saying he doesn't like to suffer fools. And he can be rather irascible. But he leads his army into battle. The most famous was here in Arakan at the beginning of 1945. And they fight alongside British commandos. They achieve a great victory. And he is mentioned in dispatches and given introduced, actually, after this battle to Lord Mountbatten, who's overall in charge of the Southeast Asia Command. But I want to just read a little bit about this as I explain it in the book, because I think it shows the contradictions and the tensions around empire that's affecting everybody. I write about this success, and then I say Bill Slim was thrilled. He'd also, recently, they'd thrown a massive Bailey Bridge over the Chinwin River as part of his invasion in 1945 into Burma. I had asked for the impossible, Slim said, and got it. The confidence and momentum of 14th Army at the beginning of 1945 was down to a stunning all-hands effort that threw up new barracks, depots, roads, railways, pipelines, airfields, and hospitals at astonishing speed. All of this took the enthusiastic collaboration of hundreds of thousands of men and women, the colonizer and the colonized, the white, the black, and the brown. But that's not the complete story of Burma in 1945. Tens of thousands of Indian soldiers would soon stand on the banks of the Irrawaddy, the great river that bisects central Burma, all poised to fight. However, not all of them took their orders from Bill Slim. A substantial number were members of the INA, and they were there to risk their lives for the cause of a free India in alliance with the Japanese. The nation in which they were fighting also contained many thousands of people who had volunteered to resist the British in the hope of creating an independent Burma. And this was itself a microcosm of a region in which popular sympathies were very much divided. Millions of Burmese, Malays, Javanese, Borneans, Sumatrans, and others had been delighted to see the Japanese sweep the British and other colonial powers out of their lives a few years earlier. The cruel stupidity of the Japanese army had by 1945 alienated a large proportion of them, but that did not mean that a reconquest of the old colonies would be in any way welcome or popular. One of the victorious British commandos who'd fought with Timmy at Kangor had cause to reflect on the politics of the moment. During the fighting, Private Ralph Victor came upon a local family hiding in the jungle, and he saw, behind a tree, quotes, a young Burmese girl, 17 or 18, and a baby, maybe only a month old. They were both dead in a pool of blood. And the thought occurred to me, was it our shelling that did that? Was it the shells that I'd fired that killed her? Or was it when the Japs mortared us when they were counterattacking? And then I looked around at where I was, and it occurred to me, it didn't really matter who'd killed her. She was in her homeland, and here were two foreign powers fighting for that. And that's why she and her baby were dead. For all his pride in his men, for all the comradeship with the commandos he'd fought alongside, Timmy knew these things better than most, which is why his perspectives and the choices that he made are so interesting. His own brother, who is also in the army, goes to fight for Bose. Men of his time were very torn. There's a real chance he might have to fight a battle against his own brother. But he stays with it. And I'm glad he does. And he builds an institution that, in my view, wins the war and deserves a lot more credit than it gets. But I'll come back to that. First of all, this chap. The real hero of Indian independence. That's what Prime Minister Modi tells us. Well, he was a charming, charismatic, impressive young man. He was a brilliant campaigner, became internationally famous. He was a constitutional politician at first. He was in charge of the Congress Party. If he'd stayed down that path, he could have been the first Prime Minister of independent India. In fact, he'd been predicted to have that role. He was on the front cover of Time magazine in 1938. But it's the 30s, and there are young men in a hurry. And what impresses them? The dictators of Europe. Hitler, Mussolini, and in his case, Stalin. Men of action. Men who could wipe the slate clean, this dead old world that's just given us imperialism and a global depression. We need men of action, a paramilitary society, get things done. Plus, it's kind of glamorous, isn't it? All those burning torches, those crimson flags, the marching soldiers. Anybody who'd stood on a soapbox and rabble-roused a crowd can tell you it feels pretty good. And he got into that. So slowly but surely, he moves from constitutional politics to, well, what should we call him? At the time, he was called a traitor, a quisling, but he's often also called a hero, a man of principle. He flees India, he goes to Berlin, he meets with the architects of the Holocaust, he goes to visit concentration camps, he becomes personally friendly with two of the men at the Wannsee conference, where they planned the final solution. He appears at dinner parties with Himmler, with Goebbels, and he's challenged on this. He has a left-wing background. He is challenged on this. And his friends say, well, why are you hanging out with these Nazis? And he says this, or this is how I interpret what he says based on his diaries. Because he's there in 41 and 42 when the Holocaust is really picking up steam and terrible things are happening in the East. Bose makes for a soft target now. It's easy to contrast him at a gossipy drinks party in that glorious summer of victory in Berlin with what was happening at the exact same moment in town squares, forest clearings, and isolated quarries across Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic provinces. Places from where stories of the difficult work being done by specialized military units and their often enthusiastic local assistants did indeed make their way back to Berlin that summer and autumn. But his many defenders would argue, how can any of that horror be allowed to discredit Bose's pursuit of a dream of independence and a better world for all humanity? How can it gainsay his proven commitment to communal coexistence, racial tolerance? A man doing a great thing in a bad world is still doing a great thing, isn't he? If troops representing the men, calling you excellency and serving you strudel, are massacring Jewish women and children thousands of miles away, and you half know and half don't know about it, why should that stop you pursuing a different and decent policy of your own? Explaining this to a friend who had grown uncomfortable hearing some of the stories from the East, Bose settled on a formula he would use time and again. We won't say anything in favour of or against the Germans. We need these men, and what they do elsewhere in Europe does not concern me. So there you have it. He makes other choices too. He travels by submarine, very dramatic. This is why people make films about him. That series on Amazon, it's all about this stuff. He travels to Japan. He becomes mates with Tojo. He takes charge of the Indian National Army and really boosts them. There he is hanging out at a conference with various other people from the co-prosperity sphere that the Japanese say they're building. And then at around the same time, there are some Indian prisoners of war being killed by Japanese soldiers just outside Singapore. And that was the problem. It wasn't just the Nazis. It wasn't just the Japanese imperialists. It was his actual knowledge of what they were doing that he suppressed. He goes to Nanking as a guest of the Japanese. Nanking is the site of probably the most notorious and grotesque massacre, well, outside the Middle Ages, perhaps in all of human history. The Japanese did crimes there that are stomach-turning, not just in the hot blood of victory, but in weeks of sustained sadism. Everybody knew about Nanking. People had written books about it. It took place in the 30s. He went there as a guest of the Japanese, did this man Bose, this man that Prime Minister Modi thinks is the true hero of the Second World War. He went there and he made a speech in which he advanced the future of Pan-Asian values. Asia for the Asians, fraternity between Asian people in Nanking, where the Japanese had shown what they were like. They took him to the Andaman Islands. It was the only bit of India that the Japanese ever took, just a small group of islands. And there's a famous photograph. He pulled up a flag. It was the first free flag, the first Indian free flag, he claimed, since the 18th century. And obviously, the Japanese and the Germans made great play of this. And just last year, in the Times of India, a very mainstream publication, there was this really big, colourful article about commemorating this amazing event and how all Indians should be proud that Bose did this. And it was showed that Indian independence was coming. And yet, a week after he went to the Andaman Islands, the Japanese military authorities executed 40 of his own men without a trial because, I don't know, because they were like that. They think they suspected them of being spies for the British. Nonsense. But it just showed that even when he's allowed to run up a flag, he was actually just the puppets of people who didn't really deserve his trust. Here he is announcing the invasion of India. This is the campaign that leads up to the famous Battle of Imphal and Kohima. And they sent 25,000 of their best men. Chalo Delhi, we're off to Delhi, the road to Delhi, the march to Delhi. He really believes that when his men come into contact with the Indian army, the official British Indian army, collaborators of the British, he would call them, he really believes they will desert and join him and march to Delhi and take over the country. And that would justify all the deals he'd done with the Nazis and the Japanese. Lots of publicity. They're trying to use Gandhi there, which is quite funny because Gandhi couldn't stand Bose. But come across to our side, fight for a new India. Didn't really work. There were hardly any deserters. In fact, there were some the other way, because once again, the Japanese let him down. Bad equipment, bad leadership, bad food. They treated his own men really, really poorly. And it was a bit of a disaster. There, on the other hand, is the British Indian Army, Timmy's army. By now, it's incredible. It's an amazing fighting machine. I think there are 28 Victoria Crosses won by Indian-born soldiers in that campaign. So his gamble didn't work. And yet, this makes you think a lot about history, the story of Bose, and how history is just really, really annoying. And this is maybe a slightly specious comparison, but I kind of think that history rewards extremists, you know what I mean? Here's Modi praying at the shrine of Bose, and here's the band Kneecap, who are famously very pro-IRA. Now, I reported for the BBC in the 90s. I remember the thrill, how exciting it was when there was just this idea that the communities that were at war could come together. If any of you have seen the series Derry Girls, you might get a sense of that. It was a beautiful moment. 30 years later, maybe it's easier just to say, oh yeah, up the IRA, you know, they're the real winners. Because I think history is rather kind to extremists. It's a simple thing in a tweet or a football chant. And I think the same thing's happened with Bose in India. I don't think he deserves the acclaim he gets. I think Timmy and his army, as Nehru predicted, they were the essential skeleton organization, the infrastructure for the new India. And indeed, he went on to run the Indian army in the years after the war. But as I say, empire covers everything. The Atlantic Charter was this statement of bold and progressive ideas, and had the Allies followed it, we would be living in a very different world now, but they didn't. And they didn't for various reasons. First of all, Roosevelt was driving a lot of this, and Roosevelt dies, very inconveniently. He dies just before the end of the war. I mean, even before he dies, though, America is changing. It's becoming a little bit of an empire itself. It's got a massively increased military. It's got a huge navy. It's taking all these bases in the Pacific, for example, that could come in rather handy in the future. And on a strict reading of the Atlantic Charter, they should have given them to the local people. They kind of didn't. So things are beginning to change. And I think perhaps the best and maybe most shocking example of that is the story I had at the beginning. A story I think many people in Britain don't know. And that's about what happened in Indochina. So the OSS are the forerunners of the CIA. And the OSS were working in Vietnam with Ho Chi Minh and his guerrillas. Now, Ho Chi Minh was a communist. He looked to people like Mao Zedong for inspiration. But he was a very popular nationalist as well, and he ran a really good army. And he became very friendly to these guys from the OSS. They helped train him. They did joint missions. They fought alongside the Americans. And the OSS guys wrote these very long memos to Washington to say, it's obviously the war is now coming to an end. We really think it's in America's best interests and the region's best interests if Ho Chi Minh and his militia take over the country. And we've told him that. And initially, Washington agreed. Then Roosevelt dies. The message doesn't quite get through to Vietnam. See that? That is a Declaration of Independence from September. The Americans helped him draft that. You can probably guess why. Look at the first line. All men are created equal. It's the American Declaration of Independence. He was very actually into that. He'd studied in America. He'd studied in Europe. He really was fascinated by political history. And he thought he was going to get what he'd been promised. But over in Europe, de Gaulle and Churchill are having a conversation. Now, to be honest, even before the ink was dry on the Atlantic Charter, Churchill was sort of, using one of his favourite words, weaseling a bit. He tried to make it clear to his MPs that they didn't really mean the British Empire or the European empires. What they meant was bringing freedom to the nations dominated by these terrible tyrants like Hitler and the Japanese. That isn't what Roosevelt thought it meant, by the way, or the rest of the world. Anyway, de Gaulle is a proud man. France has been humiliated and occupied. He wants glory again. And he wants the income from the old plantations, and he wants Indochina back. And Churchill agrees with him. So they put together a military force. And it's explicitly in writing to preserve the future of the white race in Asia. Which the guys in the Indian Army who are actually involved in this fighting, they might have thought that was a rather interesting phrase to read. And of course, it all goes horribly wrong. Well, I mean, it's a victory. They do fight this battle. They kick Ho Chi Minh out. He is outraged. There's a guerrilla war starts, a war that really will then last for another 30 years in different forms. But to make it really offensive to the Vietnamese, and this is something every Vietnamese person knows, but I bet you very few British people do, is that the British and the French become short of manpower. So what do you think they do? They release tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners of war. They give them weapons, and they fight under British command and French command against the army of Ho Chi Minh, the Viet Minh. So think about that for a second. Here's a group of people who had been allied to the West, to Britain and America, 2 weeks earlier. They're now fighting a war against Britain using Japanese prisoners of war in a country the Japanese had just occupied. And by the way, this is all happening when the newspapers in the world are full of the most awful stories of what had really happened in the prisoner of war camps and the death railways, the terrible atrocities that had been committed by the Japanese. But here they were. Something very similar happens in Indonesia as well. And there's a great photograph. I should have put it in this presentation. Lord Mountbatten flies in to inspect all these troops, and they're Japanese troops. So, go back to the Atlantic Charter, a future of self-determination in a free world. So here's a British aristocrat using Indian and Japanese troops to put the colonial masters back in charge of a country that clearly wanted independence. It isn't right. And it was morally wrong at the time, but it was also strategically very foolish, because certainly in the case of Vietnam, there are millions of deaths result from this. There's the war with the French in Vietnam. There's the war with the Americans. The Australians are dragged in. Millions and millions of people will die. And what happens at the end? Ho Chi Minh runs the country, which is what the OSS had recommended 30 years earlier. The Washington Post found all these memos at the height of the Vietnam War, when it was the biggest issue in America. And they published them on the front page, and they said, what the hell? Our own people had predicted that this man was popular, and he wanted to deal with us. He wrote all these lovely letters. He quotes our Declaration of Independence. Why is all this happening? And I'm afraid it goes back to that moment in Paris between Churchill and de Gaulle and what I call imperial muscle memory. As I said, I'm not one of those people that agrees with lefty academics who say the British Empire is awful. I have written love letters to the generation that have won the war. We were absolutely on the right side of history. But I think if you want your history warts and all, and critically, if you want to understand how the rest of the world sees us and saw us, you need to understand this other stuff too. This is a small story. It's a small story, but I think it's quite interesting because it just sheds light on the messiness, really, of this time. And it also gives me an opportunity to tell one of my jokes. So, Borneo has a big hinterland full of tribes, mostly the Dayak people. There's one of them there. On the coast, though, in the Sarawak region, there are some of the most productive oil fields in the world. And the Royal Dutch Shell Company, which is 50% British-owned, wants them back. So, there's also a camp on board, a camp in this island called Sandakan. Now, Sandakan is a rather, especially if you're Australian, a rather notorious place because of the 2,500 men at the beginning of 1945 in this camp, 6 survive. So they're almost all massacred. Now, this chap here, it's called Toby Carter. He's actually from New Zealand, but he's part of an Australian group called the SRD, Services Reconnaissance Department. And he sent in on a mission to work with the Dayaks to launch a little guerrilla war against the Japanese prior to the invasion of the island by the Australian army, which sounds kind of plausible. But after the war, paperwork was discovered that there had been another mission called Operation Kingfisher. These same guys were planning this mission. And that was to try and save the people in this camp. It might not have worked. A similar one, not far away, that the Americans carried out did work. And of course, at this time, the Japanese they have virtually no navy, no air force. There was a reasonable opportunity, I think, for them to save at least a few hundred of these guys. But it turns out that that plan was, to quote the documents, deprioritized in order for this plan to go ahead. And the people who ran this after the war wrote that they were operating to a specifically colonial agenda to prepare the way for the return of colonial government. Now, you can understand that, I think. You can understand why they'd want to fight guerrilla war to help the Australians land and take back control of the islands. And, let's face it, we were going to take back Malaya. Not every country was heading for independence, but it was prioritized over a chance to save 2,500 Australians. And I think that's pretty terrible, especially so when you realize what happens in this mission, because it all goes really very badly wrong. So, the people who, you heard the health and safety talk, they did ask me to add a couple of supplementaries before I do this next section. Is anybody here who might be offended by the rough language commonly used by ordinary soldiers? Very good to hear. Now, and this is a bit more sensitive. Is there anybody here who, I don't know how to put this, is Australian? Good, good. On March 25th, 1945, the engines of Liberator bombers were not the only things making unfamiliar noises on the Kelabit Plateau. Fuck 'em all, fuck 'em all, the long and the short and the tall. Fuck all the sergeants and WO1s, fuck all the corporals, and fuck all their mums. Few of the men and women swaying and cheering in the longhouse understood the words, but they clearly grasped the sentiment as the men of Seamut 2 celebrated a day that had gone much better than any of them had expected. After many rounds of borak, the potent local rice wine, their hosts had stood up to sing traditional Dayak praising songs in honour of their guests, each accompanied by an obligatory toast. And so it seemed like simple good manners to respond in the finest traditions of the Australian Army. 'Cause we're saying fuck off to 'em all, as back to their billets they crawl. There's fuck all promotion this side of the ocean, so cheer up my lads. Yeah, you get the rest of it. So then I tell the story of what they promised them. They've come and they've promised these people protection. And they promise them that they will pay for human heads. It's a headhunting culture. This is rather exciting to the people of this and other communities, and many of them volunteer. But as I say, to end this section, it was an impressive and persuasive pitch, although unfortunately, and wholly unknown to the men singing late into the night, high on the Kelabit Plateau, most of its most important points and promises would turn out to be worth fuck all. Because these people are horribly, horribly badly treated. They are encouraged, they're told that when the invasion comes, they'll get help, but when the invasion comes, the local Australians want nothing to do with this mission. They describe it as a British mission. The Japanese go inland, they start slaughtering the Dayaks. It descends into a kind of heart of darkness nightmare. And this is one story from that. By now, everybody knew the dire fate of prisoners, so when two soldiers became separated from their unit and heard foreign voices close by, they tried frantically to hide. But they were soon discovered by the riverbank. Their captors tied them to trees, then took turns to spit and punch and kick them through a long and agonizing night. At first light, they were made to kneel, then both were beheaded with a sword. It was a sadly common story of brutality during the war against Japan in the Indo-Pacific. Except in this case, the soldiers were Japanese, and their captors were in a unit commanded by an officer of Australia's SRD. It all gets very ugly. When some of the official soldiers come to some of these jungle camps and they see what's going on, they try and arrest their own comrades. They want to put these guys up for court-martial because of what they're doing there. And it all gets very, very nasty. And it doesn't seem to actually help the invasion. Certainly the guys running it said it caused them nothing but trouble. So even under its own terms, it didn't really work. And to be honest, even the sort of secret colonial agenda, it's hard to understand how it could really have furthered the reconquest of those oil fields. That's what the invasion did. And yet this is the mission that was prioritized over the saving of those men. So yeah, a depressing story, intriguing, colourful, maybe quite exciting if you're part of it. I think Special Forces are tempted to missions like this. They're excited about doing secret jungle attacks. Maybe that appealed to them more than the other option they had before them. But after the war, there was a huge political row about this. And then since about 1950, hardly anybody in Australia has ever spoken about it. So that's very sad. But I don't want you to think that I've written a book or that I believe that it's all bad, it's all wrong. And what I want to say is that you have to see it in full. You have to understand, in my view, that Britain's power, drawn from its empire, and it was an age of empires, was why it was able to do remarkable things. And you can't really separate the two. I actually started writing this book because my mother-in-law told me to, which is a pretty good reason to do anything, I'm sure you'll agree. My mother-in-law grew up in a little town in Devon. And when she was young, her future husband, my father-in-law, Tony, was treated by a doctor who'd been in the army. And she said, it's a lovely story, Phil, because they had polio and it was a new thing and he was very good and they really saved Tony's life, or saved him from being seriously paralysed, because polio was a very dangerous disease. And I thought, well, that might make a nice final chapter for the book. Then I discovered something astonishing. This man is called Douglas Peterkin, and he was part of probably the most remarkable medical feat in the history of warfare, and one of the greatest stories of the British Army in the Second World War, because he was one of the first men into Belsen, the Belsen concentration camp in 1945. And they came across scenes, you'll be familiar with the footage. That footage kind of defines the Holocaust. All of those dead bodies being pushed into mass graves and pushed by lorries, and it's very, very, very famous and awful imagery. But of course, not everybody was dead. There were 40 or 50,000 people desperately, desperately ill, all on the very, very, very underfed, emaciated, and most of them had typhus. These doctors, and there were only really about a dozen of them, managed to organise within 10 days an absolutely original way of treating this situation that's still studied today. That medical volunteers flew in from Sheffield, from Liverpool, from London, even though they knew, and many of them did get typhus, they knew that would be a risk. Peterkin gets typhus himself. It's almost impossible not to. They improvised treatments, famine relief powders, and a thing called the human laundry. That's just one of the few photographs I could show, where they take people, they strip them off, they burn their clothes, they cover them in DDT, they give them new food. It was absolutely remarkable how many they saved. They couldn't save them all. I mean, these people were so weak and so ill that some of them died anyway, despite the best care, and they did really get some very good care. But it was such an amazing story, and to discover that I had this personal connection through my mother-in-law to this man was a remarkable moment for me. And I just want to read you one little section. Captain Douglas Peterkin and his fellow medics struggled to empty the huts in anything like an orderly fashion amid distressing scenes of panic and despair. But for those who were carried to Johnny Johnson's human laundry and able to tolerate the various food supplements now being offered, the changes could be rapid and remarkable. 3/4 of the survivors were women and girls, and most had been living in a desperate, exhausted, and emaciated state for weeks. The long and detailed equipment list for 11 light field ambulance never contained quantities of lipstick or face powder. But Douglas Peterkin soon discovered that such things could be lifesavers too. Quote, a very large quantity of lipstick arrived. This was not at all what we men wanted. We were screaming for hundreds and thousands of other things, and I don't know who asked for this lipstick. I wish so much that I did know, because it was the action of sheer unadulterated brilliance. I believe nothing did more for the welfare of these internees than that lipstick. I saw women laying in bed with no sheets but scarlet red lips. You saw them wandering around the camp with nothing but a blanket over their shoulder, but with red lips. At last, here was someone who'd done something to make them feel individuals again, that they were more than the number tattooed onto their arm. That lipstick started to give them back their humanity. And then I found this gentleman in Sydney. He's a survivor of Belsen who was personally saved by Douglas Peterkin. And I'll show you a picture in a minute. I helped him to come to do a speech in London where he met my mother-in-law. And yes, of course, you know, the Holocaust is a massive story. And what happened to my family, though important to me, is a very small story. But the idea that this remarkable man connected the two, I found very moving. So I want to read you just one little final passage about this, because this is my mother-in-law. She is that girl on the left when she was very young. That's VE Day, 1945. And that was, they didn't call it polio, they called it infantile paralysis, because it did indeed make people paralyzed. So this Dr. Peterkin was known as being rather brusque. In fact, he wasn't welcomed by many of the doctors and the medical teams. They had this idea he was a bit of a socialist. He didn't play golf. He wasn't a member of the Conservative Club. He was a bit of an outsider. I later discovered he loved to play golf, by the way, because I'm now in touch with his children. But he was seen as a bit of an outsider, and people would often ask for one of the older doctors, if you please. Anyway, Tony Bryant, that's my father-in-law, his parents called him up and said, we don't want that young man. We find him rather rude, because he didn't really have much patience. I mean, you wouldn't, would you, if you'd been to Belsen, when somebody's complaining about their bunions? You might think it was a bit kind of beneath you. But anyway, he went, and they were disappointed when he arrived. So the abrupt and difficult Dr. Peterkin arrived on the doorstep. He went upstairs and spent a great deal of time examining their son, carefully manipulating his arms, legs, and spine, with a concerned look on his face. Then he announced that the boy must be taken to Exeter Hospital immediately for some important tests. He wrote a letter to them to hand to the doctors there and said to Tony that he would need an injection into his back. It would be rather painful, but he must prepare to be brave for his mother's sake. The lumbar puncture was indeed most unpleasant, but the spinal fluid that was extracted confirmed everything that Peterkin had feared. Tony was infected with the polio virus and needed urgent hospital treatment. As her son started receiving the urgent care that would save his life, Mrs. Bryant rushed to thank the doctor she'd never asked for and never spoke another bad word about him for the rest of her life. As with Eddie Boas, another small boy suffering from an infectious disease in a city many miles away, Douglas Peterkin had come across someone in Devon who needed the help he was uniquely qualified to give. No, that it was his pleasure and his purpose to give. And he hadn't hesitated for a moment. So, oh, by the way, that's Jennifer meeting Eddie Boas. It's a rather lovely moment in the story of my family. Empire was ending. We like to think in Britain, it's a part of our pub wisdom, that Britain sacrificed an empire to beat Hitler and the Japanese. It's not quite like that. I think India was always going to get its independence. Britain didn't really sacrifice its empire. It fought rather hard and rather dirty in places like Borneo to keep going. Malaya wasn't given a chance because Malaya was very profitable. Of course, we helped the French get back into Indochina. A whole load of things were done that I don't think really sit very well with the cause that we were supposed to be fighting for. They don't sit very well with what we're celebrating today. And like I say, I am one of those people that roll their eyes when lefty academics go on and on about empire. But I think we need to know all of it. We need to know the warts and all if we were to understand that time and those people. And this is how I put it anyway, at the end of this book. Of the rightness of the cause and Britain's pivotal role, there can be no doubt. Some empires build concentration camps, and some build human laundries. The British Empire built both those things in the course of its rise and fall. But in the time of Douglas Peterkin, it should be remembered for the good that it did and the courage it displayed. Thank you very much for your attention and your time, and I'd love to take any questions.